Hello, 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 and welcome to today's episode of Her Version. This podcast is dedicated to sharing stories of struggle to triumph, a platform that allows individuals to tell their truth in order to inspire and uplift others. For those of you that are new to this podcast and like content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, follow, like, and share. I am your host, Sabrina Victoria. Let's jump right in. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this awesome episode of Her Version. The Her Version platform is built on storytelling and the understanding that many times our greatest learning experiences come from listening to other people's stories. Today, I'm speaking with an amazing woman named Sarah Salter Kelly. Oh, I didn't even ask you if that's correct. Sarah Salter Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Girl, that flows nice.
Yeah.
I love it. Sarah is a talented writer, healer, and speaker. She utilizes the raw, compounded teachings of her life experience to uplift, empower, and guide others. Her wisdom is authentic, embodied, and hard-won, generated through years of integrating the tragic homicide of her mother and learning to forgive the perpetrator, alongside 30 years of studying personal development, personal growth, restorative justice, and earth-based healing traditions. Over the past 15 years, she has run a private healing practice, facilitated retreats in Canada and in Peru, taught trauma-focused workshops, presented at conferences, public events. Most recently, she has authored her first book, Trauma as Medicine. She is a mother, wife, and lover of organic gardening, as well as an avid outdoor enthusiast. Her spare time is spent exploring the edges of the wild for solace, connection, and the challenge of physical endurance. Sarah resides in Grand Forks, BC, with her family. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
Hello, Sabrina. I am really grateful to be here today. I'm listening to your intro and watching some of the intro video. I was like, fuck, I'm in the right place.
Yes, girl.
I've been using story-based teachings for such a long time. And so it feels really good to be somewhere where that awareness is valued.
Yes, 100. So just so you know, our last guest speaker was our 350th female on the
Wow.
platform. Isn't that awesome?
Wow, that's pretty awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So super, super exciting, all based on the importance of sharing some of our past and some of our journey and all that goodness. So I so appreciate you being here, taking some time out of your day. I know that we're all so busy, and now you have a new book released. So there's always a gazillion things to be doing when we're entrepreneurs and we're building our own empires. So I so appreciate you taking some time out of your day to sit down, share some of your journey, your book, and all the awesome things that you're doing for all the humans. So I love to kind of start out by asking, just diving into the deep end, if you're okay with that.
Let's do it. I like diving deep too. And so what I was thinking is one of the ways that I like to start off when I'm doing a talk is often reading a little bit of the introduction from my book.
I would love it.
To give a segue into, the next part, which is going to be talking about homicide and healing trauma. So once upon a time, long, long ago, so long ago, in fact, that even the oldest of our grandmothers and grandfathers cannot remember, there existed a time and a community that honored and celebrated our deepest wounds as the passage for our soul's evolution. They knew that the initiation into higher learning came from fully embodying the energy of pain until it transformed into something inconceivable, something beyond the scope of the mind and into the wisdom of the soul. This was a process of allowing the poison of what had come to pass to rise up within, to care for this energy with wild dancing, music, crying, wailing, and other embodiment until it emerged as medicine. It seems to me that these folks were in the long ago, but perhaps what I am imagining are the whispers of the ancestors yet to come. The ones who know that what the underworld has to teach us about who we are and who we are becoming is essential. This is a book for those of you who are kin to those ancient future past ancestors, those of you who are tired of ingesting the poison of avoidance, denial, and spiritual bypass, and are ready to delve into the deep, dark territory of medicine making. This is a book for those of you who are hungry for more. And so that's from the intro of Trauma as Medicine, and offers the perfect foundation for what I want to share and speak about. The awareness that somehow what has come to pass in our lives has showed up for a reason. And if we are able to form a healthy relationship with that, we can actually use it to be the foundation that feeds the roots of who we are becoming, instead of getting stuck in that painful place of poison, of avoidance, denial, pretending that we are either someone that we're not, or putting on the faces that are hiding what the actual pain is that we're carrying with us all the time. And we're always haunted by what we haven't addressed. It doesn't go anywhere. And I think what often happens through time is that we come to a place in our own personal development or spiritual healing where we recognize it's up to us to deal with this. And through most of my spiritual practice is related to earth-based teachings. And so I find the mythos of the underworld to be a very helpful metaphor to utilize when we're addressing trauma, because trauma feels like something that is buried way down deep in the dark places of the earth. And it's not something that we can logically understand often why something happened, what we can do about it in a way that feels orderly and quantifiable. We have to instead go into the soul place in our heart centers, and slowly, of our own accord, as we feel safe and comfortable, build a relationship that helps us to metabolize what has come to pass. And so for myself, that was the brutal rape and homicide of my mother. Back in December of 1995, she was attacked by a stranger in the parking garage of her work. And so she had what almost all women are horrified of happening, right? Being overcome by a stranger in a dark place and not having the power to do anything about it. And although there was evidence that she most definitely fought this perpetrator over the course of the last 20 minutes of her life, and she was violently raped. Her body was thrown into the back of her vehicle and then tossed out of town in an abandoned farmhouse. And we didn't know what had happened to her for about 10 days. So she was a missing woman over that 10-day period. And I was 20 years old at the time, not living at home with my parents. I lived with my then boyfriend and now husband of 28 years. And what happens in the acute phase of trauma is that we just have to get through it, right? That's not the time where we're contemplating how to turn our trauma into medicine, right? If somebody had said that to me back then, I probably would have punched them in the face. But as time goes by, as we start to recognize that it's not going away, that's when each of us, of our own accord, come to a place where we start to contemplate, how can we find meaning and purpose in what has happened? And so in those first few years, I navigated that very difficult and visceral territory of being with the most unexpected loss. I also, was a very devout pagan at the time and very much honored the goddess and the sacred feminine. And so I felt like I had been forsaken. And my mother was a personal growth coach, right? So she was a life coach in the 80s when nobody knew about life coaching back then. And so I very much grew up around with like Louise Hay at the kitchen table and Shakti Gawain and all of these authors, that Wayne Dyer, Marianne Williamson, that are really well known still to this day, formed the foundation of a lot of my understanding of who I am and how we have the potential within ourselves to connect with source, cultivate our beliefs, and choose our own reality. And so most obviously, when I was sitting there and contending with the fact that, I believed everything happened for a reason, and I believed there was purpose in everything, and that there was no accidents. And then here's my mother, who very much trusted her intuition, violently murdered in the parking garage of her work. I struggled with, well, how the hell can that still be true? And I would hear her throughout the years, and I'd be arguing with her in my head, and she'd be like, Sarah, there's no accidents. Sarah, trust your gut. Everything happens for a reason. And I would argue back saying, well, used to believe you, but your credibility is really low right now because it didn't really work out good on your end. And yet, regardless of that, through the years, I found that my body, and I come from a very somatic approach to my own healing back when nobody knew what somatic was. And to me, it was just trusting your instincts. My body very much would say, well, when I decide to believe that somehow there's purpose and meaning in this, I actually feel pretty great. I feel like I can somehow generate resiliency and a sense of personal power. When I feel like I'm totally effed and nothing good is going to come of this, I feel victimized and helpless and stuck. And so much of the way I addressed my own healing came from me determining from what I noticed my body telling me how I could move forward. And most of this was through my own practice. There wasn't really anybody outside of myself that helped me to cultivate a sense of peace or healing along the way. And as I've said, this was in 1995, Sabrina. So I've had a lot of time to process this and to evaluate what was meaningful, inclusive of the years of teaching personal growth programs and energy healing that have helped to, me to recognize through the people that I've worked with. What I think is a really important piece would be after my mother's perpetrator was found guilty of murder 1 in 1997, he suicided in prison. And he'd only been out of jail for 5 days. And so much of, my own, again, reckoning with what was the point was, well, here's my mother who's dead. Here's this man who's dead. And I kind of put my prayer forth to the universe, show me, like, what's this all about? And, and that meant I had a lot of expressing of my emotions, a lot of grieving to do. I would be outside walking through the rivers or the ravines of the land that I live on, crying and singing out loud. And I never cared what anybody thought, who, might also be like, who's that crazy little hippie kid, screaming and crying in the ravine. That didn't matter to me. My own process took precedence over what anybody else thought. And I would rather express that feeling inside of me and let it go than hold it inside out of fear of judgment from an external source. And eventually in time, when I had expressed most of the grief towards my mother's loss, which was, I'd say, in those first 10 years, I came to recognize that I had a lot of unexpressed feelings towards her perpetrator that I had never accessed or addressed. For a long time, I had thought, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
And yet at the 10-year mark, I could feel him around me, and he wasn't going anywhere. Right? I would use all the energy I could to try and push him away and not think about him, but that just made him come in closer. And so I thought, okay, Sarah, you have this philosophy that there's no such thing as garbage, that somehow we can compost and process and assimilate what comes to pass in life. So what would happen if instead of pushing him away, you called him in? What would that look like? And so that changed the way that I saw what was happening, where I realized that I actually had power to do that. And I could actually discern for myself what that looked like and create my own process to address unresolved feelings of anger, my own sense of victimization that I had never acknowledged, and basically just connect with the sacred and ask for help. And so, Sabrina, over the course of probably about 9 months, it was once a week for 9 months, I had this ceremony where I cried, drummed, screamed, prayed, burned things. You name it, it was happening. Right? I was expressing whatever anger was inside of me. I felt like I had a lot of time on my hands because I had twin girls that were in kindergarten, and I had a newborn son that slept for an hour and a half in the morning. I was like, wow, I have all this free time. And so what I discovered through that process is, first off, how important it is for us to acknowledge what we're holding inside of us, and that we absolutely can address anybody that has done us wrong. That's possible within, we don't have to speak to them in person, and likely if he was alive, I wouldn't have been able to anyway. But we get to choose whether or not we're holding that feeling all day and allowing that feeling to keep us small in our lives. And I very much had to express that. And so something really unexpected happened over about 2 or 3 months into that ceremony. I find it very easy to go on my own type of journey or meditation. And in part, that's due to my mother with all the meditation tapes she had when I was a kid, and I would listen to them at night. And so I'm having this meditation journey. I see myself, or a woman, sitting on this sand wall with this little pyramid in front of her. And she has her arm around this little boy. And she's, wrapping her whole energy body around him and offering him up all of this love and compassion. And this little boy is really concerned about something he has to take responsibility for that's in the pyramid. And so I see and feel this woman comforting this little boy, and then my conscious mind kicks in, and I realize that the woman in that journey, in that visualization, was myself, and that the little boy was Peter Bright Eyes, the person who murdered my mom. And I pulled myself out of that with a whole bunch of swearing, and then shame. I initially felt so much shame because I had what would my family think? I had these feelings of compassion for this really bad guy. And he was a really bad guy. I mean, she was brutally murdered. And as I said, he'd been in prison and actually in and out of the system his whole life. And so, but I couldn't, and then I felt pissed off that compassion had hijacked my ceremony where I was supposed to be getting angry, right? I was like, well, what the hell? I wasn't doing this for compassion. And yet I could not deny the fact that there was this seed of compassion planted inside of me, and this was in 2006, that started to make me curious over the course of the next few years as to who else was this guy other than a murderer, right? Who else was he? And this pondering of shared humanity started to lead me down an unexpected course in my life. As the time went by, I had more visions or experiences that led me to eventually recognize that I really wanted to know about who he was and where he came from. And see, he was First Nations. And in Canada, many of the people who are First Nations, particularly where I used to live in Alberta, live on reserves. And so the reserves are land that was allotted during treaty signings. And so there's a big history of colonization and a big history of suppression and a big history of genocide. And even those, few words don't do justice to the history. And interestingly enough, actually, I'm just thinking about this while I talk, Sabrina. It's Thanksgiving Day in Canada today. And so that is very interesting because of the, most people of settler origin are celebrating this time of coming to this country, but it's not necessarily a time of celebration for many people who are First Nations. And so I digressed. Eventually, I was led to connect with the chief and council of the reserve that Peter was from, seeking to understand the history of his own people, perhaps to connect with his family. And I was put in touch with a former chief who just gave me a really great education through the years about the history of the particular reserve that he was from, Saddle Lake Cree First Nation. And then I was invited to teach trauma as medicine circles and workshops at many different events happening in the Saddle Lake area and then around Alberta through the years. And so, it definitely amounted to this full circle experience of healing. And I also knew that he had a sister. I wasn't connected with his sister through speaking with Eric, but I remembered that he had a sister, Marilyn Bright Eyes, that was in a CBC documentary in the late 90s called Beating the Streets. And I connected with her through Facebook. And just reaching out saying like, I didn't know what I wanted from her. I knew I needed to connect with her, but I was so uncomfortable with the awareness that my vulnerability would potentially just cause me to be rejected. And yet I needed to reach out. And so I did. And she was quite kind and forthcoming with sharing any information that she could. She's 13 years younger than him. And so didn't really grow up with him at home, and definitely was at the receiving end of violence from him when he was home. And so it brought forth a lot of deeper understanding as to the history of violence. And so I share this story quite often in many different circles with the idea that if we allow ourselves to go deeper into the heart of our greatest grief and trauma, we will be really surprised as to where it leads us. The Marilyn and I have shared stories together before, and at one of the first ones that we ever shared at, and I speak of this in my book, just out of nowhere, she apologized to me, and I wasn't expecting that. It wasn't her fault that her brother killed my mother, but just out of nowhere, she said, geez, that would be really horrible to lose your mother like that. I'm really sorry my brother did that. And, I felt such a profound sense of connection in my heart. It was in a First Nations community. So the elders that were there paused our group and sang a song and offered us some prayers. And so if I hadn't been determined to understand his humanity, that experience of lived reconciliation never would have come to pass. And the beauty of understanding the story of somebody who's so different from me, and in particular in this case, not to minimize the violence and the way that my mother died, yet to understand the perpetrator means stepping out of white privilege and into a place of awareness of the history of the land that I live on.
Awesome. I love that. What's the number one lesson that you think you've learned about life through all of that?
I think that freedom is up to us. We get to choose that. That shows up in how we live our lives each day and how we address our challenges. And so we determine that, and that freedom is not dependent on external variables. You can be free and in prison. Freedom is one of the teachers I followed a lot through the years, especially in the late 90s, is a woman by the name of Gangaji, who it's, non-dual teachings and a lot of what she speaks to. She does a lot of work in prisons in the States. And so it's helping inmates to make that connection with their own relationship with the highest part of themselves, right? So we can do that. Nothing's holding us back from that, except for our ego, our reluctance or refusal to forgive, our need to hold on to anger, our need to be right, to prove, all of those kinds of things that keeps us from fully living our lives with freedom. And then the world that we live in is a consequence of that.
Yeah, definitely 100%. When you were telling your story, the words that came up the most were meaning and purpose. There's a meaning and purpose for everything, something that your mother had shared with you. So what was the meaning and the purpose? Have you come to a meaning and purpose that feels authentic to you?
I think that meaning and purpose are not something that can be summarized into an actual thing that we have. That the meaning and purpose are an action, and it's how we live our lives. And I think that so often in Western culture, we want the thing. Like we want to know. In my private healing practice through the years, I've often had people come where the desire is to live with more purpose. I want to know my purpose. What is my purpose? I need that thing. And it's so elusive, and every time we attach to the thing, all of a sudden it changes and we don't feel like we can hold it. And I think because purpose is not something that is a thing or an end goal. I think meaning and purpose is how we live each day. And if we recognize that how we live each day is inclusive of meaning and purpose, that what we're looking for is what's happening here. We don't need to read more, become smarter, take the next course, do the X, Y, and Z that tells us that we're worthy of experiencing that. This is actually what it looks like. And so in reference to my mother's death, it was trusting in the meaning and purpose that was showing up through the engagement that I was making with her perpetrator's family, as well as the First Nations reserve that he was from, and in other First Nations communities around Canada. And what I have discovered from that is that I very much believe that my mother's homicide was a result of colonization, from this idea that you can take the problem, and in Canada, it was often referenced as the Indian problem, and you can put it in this little container over here and expect it to stay there. Whereas we are all one and connected. And the more we recognize our shared humanity, the more we realize that we are all responsible for addressing the problems, particularly with the histories of systemic racism and violence.
Absolutely. That definitely makes sense. And I really appreciate you breaking that down as far as the meaning purpose, because I think that people do kind of get that confused sometimes as far as, sitting down and feeling as if it's supposed to be some sort of mission statement that's written out that you can kind of reference back to every once in a while. But what you're saying does make sense. And I think that it's also ever evolving, as we're growing and as we're going through our journey, that meaning or that purpose can evolve and change. Were you already in the self-development arena when this happened to your mother, or did you kind of really fall into it and it became a part of your world after that?
I already was before, Sabrina, and that makes a big difference. A few things I've thought of through the years or noticed in my own story, in contrast to some others when I've helped people in addressing trauma, is I did have a pretty stable home life, right? And that helped me to have my own sense of self-love and the and belief in my power to address challenges. That being said, I had very, very strict parents when I was a teenager. And so I left home right before I turned 16. And in that time period, I had to put to the test, all of the things I thought I knew, as many 16-year-olds can be very stubborn in that way. And so, I went from the suburbs to the downtown city core where I had never even been before. And so in the first 2 years I was on my own, I lived in so many precarious situations that, and I took different personal growth and life skills workshops and definitely put to the test whether or not I could listen to my intuition. And we find out whether or not we can listen to our intuition by not listening to our intuition. And then we have the experiences, right? Where we're like, oh, damn, I should have listened. And so very much at the age of 17, I had dedicated myself to the goddess was my reference to the divine at that time, to be in service for my life. And so it was very much of an awareness that my spiritual quest was the most important thing in my life. And so that was a few years before she was murdered.
That's awesome. When you met your husband, is he also in the same arena, or did this just did he fall into this with you?
We had a record store romance, and so we both worked in a music store for a few years, and I would say that I've grown on him through the years. Like I've slowly like been influencing like water on stone, right? And so in the last few years, he's actually doing a Qigong master teacher training program right now. And he started meditating regularly about 4 years ago. And so he had other ways. He was an ultra marathon runner for a long time, running 55 kilometers in one shot. And so his way of connecting with spirit would be that way. But we share many common values.
That's awesome. Was there anyone else in your family that, I mean, I'm sure there was. I guess the question is, what was the response to your mother's death with other people in your family, like father, sisters, brothers?
Well, one of the things about family, I mean, first off, for everybody, everyone's in shock, right? That's what happens. So I think that that's pretty normal for most families, and we did a pretty good job, I think, in the first few years of spending time together and connecting. We'd get together on the day that she was murdered, on the anniversary, and do what we could to honor her memory. And then, of course, as time went by, my sister and I had our own families, and and so our focus became more on growing and caring for our own family, and our times became more busy. And so we spent less time together through the years. I would say that my book coming out brought up a lot of stuff for some people in my mom's family. And I even struggled with that a little bit when I was writing it. I noticed in my head a few times I would hear like, oh, well, what will grandma think about this? Or what will, and so learning to let go of that was a really big part. I believe that everybody integrates and metabolizes and deals with trauma or grief in the way that is right for them and at their own pace and at their own timing. My mom being a life coach, like she was supposed to go and spend a 2-week winter solstice trip with Shakti Gawain 2 days after she was murdered. And so much of her spirit came from the place of recognizing that we can heal anything. So very much a part of my own drive and motivation is in connecting with her spirit and allowing that possibility to guide me.
That's awesome. When you think of other females who have lost their mother in one way or another, what would be some advice that you'd give to them?
I think the mother wound is, for me anyway, it's so challenging. And so the advice that I would give to them is to find their connection with their mother inside of themselves and to trust it. And to make space for caring for that and to talk to her.
Do you talk to your mother?
Oh, all the time. She's actually, I feel closer to her, I would say, now than in many ways in life. And I mean, I've known her more in spirit than I did as my physical mother, because it's been over 25 years since she died, and I was 20 when she died. And so very much so, it's my belief that we are not separate from the world of spirit. And so I'd say talk to her, and particularly don't be afraid to express the things that were not resolved in life. So often we have this ridiculous idea that we can't speak bad of the dead. And so then we don't deal with any of the unresolved stuff when we lose somebody, thinking, oh, I can't bring that up and they're gone. And, we feel ashamed of our own stuff. It's like, no, let that shit out. Like, you've got to go into that. You've got to tell her any of the ways that she didn't show up for you. You've got to get pissed off and get mad. And most likely you can come to a place of forgiveness and understanding through communicating that now. She doesn't have to be alive.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Sometimes it's easier.
I can see that. Definitely. I thank you for being here. I want to just real quickly acknowledge those listening live. Thank you for being here and hanging out with us. Those watching on the replay, make sure you hashtag replay so that we know that you are here or were here, and we can send you some love. But I want to ask Sarah, I know that it's been a long journey for you from then till now.
Mm.
And you've written a gorgeous book, and you're building a community around opening up and being authentic with your trauma and everything that has happened to you. Can you share with us some of what you do and the coaching that you do in your book and where people can find you?
Absolutely, Sabrina. And so you can go to my website, sarahsalterkelly.com. I do private sessions online as well as in person for those who are in Canada. I teach retreats and workshops. I have an online mentorship program that starts November 4th, actually. It's once a week. We meet 12 times over the course of 18 weeks. That would be probably the best way, I would say, to work with me, inclusive of we work through the book in detail in that. And alternately get on my email list. I am planning on traveling to the United States next fall for a few workshops. And so to stay in touch that way. In the United States, you can get my book through Ingram Sparks or Amazon. You can also order it from my website. I think it just takes a little bit longer to be shipped from my website, like probably 2 weeks, because we're counting on Canada Post and US Post.
Yeah.
So I had this amazing miracle happen where I ended up being interviewed by Marianne Williamson a couple of weeks ago, and her secretary wanted the book, I think 4 days before the show, and I'm in a small town, and she's like, yeah, can you just ship that out to us? I'm like, that might take 3 weeks. And like Amazon was like that. So that is one of the things about Amazon that is helpful. So if you're not in a rush, order it from me. Otherwise, go online.
Fantastic. And where can people find you? Where are you on social media?
Under my full name. So Sarah Salter Kelly on Instagram, on Facebook. I also have a Trauma as Medicine Facebook page.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm. And YouTube, Sarah Salter Kelly.
Who is welcome into your Trauma as Medicine group?
Anyone. Yeah, there's no vetting or anyone is welcome into the group. And most of my programs are for anyone. I do occasional programs for women or people identifying as women.
What are your big dreams for your community?
I will be speaking and sharing internationally over the next few years. And so to be bringing trauma as medicine to the whole world.
How exciting is that?
It's pretty great. It's already happening.
What do you think your mother would say?
Oh, my mother's, I know she's really proud in many ways. And she also is the one who often is giving me a kick in the ass if I need it. And so, yeah, I feel that she's pretty excited. And she is the most predominant voice in my head, right? That's always saying, just to keep believing and keep carrying it and to let go of any of my own fears or what ifs or any of that kind of resistance that I think our egos can so easily put forth as obstacles that are not even real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is your mother like the main subject of your speaking? Like, is she the main character? Or are you kind of moved past that?
No, I very much moved past that. She's just always there. It's more if people are asking. And even in my book, like a lot of the book is utilizing many different stories. And then there's meditations, journal exercises, ceremonies, so that people can really apply for themselves. It's kind of the book that in many ways I would have wanted way back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I know I have to do something here. What do I do? And most often the books I found back then, and even still to this day, kind of dance around trauma. They often teach us to be, I feel, more cautious or afraid of our triggers than necessary. Whereas my approach is like, thank you, trigger. I know where to start.
Yeah.
Right here, there's unresolved power. And I know that I have the means within myself to address it.
Yeah.
Rather than being rendered helpless by this ominous trigger ghost. How do we go into it?
Yeah, that's
So,
one of the things that I've acknowledged, over the duration of doing this podcasting. When I first started, I was getting triggered left and right. I mean, it was almost like torturous. Like
right,
so much so where I was like, I don't think that this is healthy for me,
right.
because I'm crying in like every other podcast, pulling the emotion from the other person into.
Mm,
And I started doing exactly what you're talking about. Actually, I started actually recognizing this is a trigger. This is an area of which I need to start working on, and then diving. It was helping me like quickly versus over happening over like a duration of a lifetime. It was like hitting me constantly, where so now it was like grateful. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to be taking this into like consideration, be grateful for this happening, because instead of it just happening randomly over the course of months, and then not necessarily recognizing or seeing what was going on because I'm in something, it was really helping me hone in on what that was and diving into those areas of my life.
totally.
So,
There needs to be a book called Gratitude for Triggers, right? Like
yeah,
something along because it sounds like you had a quantum experience because of the triggers. You were able to be like, okay, those are
yeah,
the ones that I have to
yeah,
into. That's where I'm losing my power.
yeah,
The culture that we live in now that is so often victimized by all the ways that they feel triggered.
yeah.
I've
And I
yeah.
remember there was this one woman who now is in a lot of my courses and programs, which is really cool. So I see her all the time. I don't even know if she knows that she did this for me. I should probably tell her, but probably like 50 podcasts in, her podcast did not trigger me. However, I said out loud, like I was just being vulnerable and open about how I had literally busted out into tears. So much so that there was a few times where I couldn't speak during
Mm,
the podcast because I was
mm,
crying. I was so moved that I couldn't even ask the next question. There's just
mm.
silence and me like covering my face, just not being able to contain myself. So I told this woman this thing about how I'm so overly emotional. And I don't know exactly what she said. I should go back and see, but it was something to the effect of exactly what I said, where their emotions are not your emotions. You have no business grabbing a hold of those, almost as if like, how dare you? I
Yeah.
mean, she's very nice about it. She's a coach,
Yeah.
but I'm have high empathetic vibes. So I'm like somewhat offended by the fact that she's saying this, but that her saying that and being like super raw and matter of fact, emotionless about it, really helped me like, wait a minute. Yeah, what am I doing? Like, I'm supposed to be holding space for these people to share, not taking it on as if
Exactly.
it's my own.
Yeah.
So it really helped me pivot a lot. So going back to meaning and purpose, like what is the meaning and the purpose of holding space for individuals?
Mm.
What is the meaning and the purpose of what was happening to me? And just that comment, her saying that or something like that, and kind of low key scolding me a little bit lovingly, really helped me reflect on my own.
I think that's a really important piece, especially for any energy healers that are listening. And I've so often heard and I'll call it the story of being empathetic. Oh, I'm such an empath. I pick up everything. And it's like, well, who the fuck are you to be picking that shit up? Who asked you?
Yes.
And it's like, I think everybody's empathetic. I think just we've been shut down so much and numbed in our culture. And so I taught Reiki for years, and we would have a conversation similar to that your role is not to be picking up everybody's emotions and carrying those home with you. You're able, as somebody who's holding space, to be that vessel between heaven and earth by connecting to what's above and below, and you're letting it go. Because when we hold it with this idea of, oh my God, that's so painful, that's so horrible, that's so awful, we're also giving the person the message that they're screwed.
Yes.
So instead of reflecting this really powerful space holding aura, if you will, we're actually sending the subliminal message that, wow, that's so horrible. I can't imagine that happening to me. And,
Yes.
you know, and so I think that that's so important to recognize that just because we're empathic doesn't mean we have an excuse to take everybody's heavy energy home with us. That, yeah, that essentially at the end of working with somebody, you want to be feeling clean and centered and grounded. And if you're not, then we can inquire as to what we can do different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
100. And I think that's the key. And that was one of the things that I have, as we have gone along, really become an expert at, is being able to hold the space with a neutral
Yeah.
platform so that the guest can feel whatever the feelings are. They don't have to be overly emotional feelings. I was thinking that that was the correct. I don't even know if I was doing it like to feed them. Like I haven't like dove that far into it as to what the meaning of that was or why I was, because I think part of it was also like I want to show them that I care. So
Yeah.
some of it was also for them,
Yeah.
like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, and I'm so sorry that I'm showing my emotion." So, like, there's a codependency there also. Like, I'd want them to know that there's just so much going on there that's just not even necessary.
Right. And where it's possible from a neutral place, I don't know if this has happened for you, Sabrina. This will often happen for me when I'm witnessing somebody's story, is that I might naturally just start crying, like tears will be coming down my
Oh,
face, but I'm still in a neutral place. But some of the witnessing is just that's part of it. And I think that one of the powers of story sharing is that each person does pick up a piece of that story, and that's important, right? And that's a why the magic of it, and it does lessen the burden of the person who's carrying it too, and that's also magic. um it's how we hold it for them,
yeah,
right? And so if we're holding it in that way of like we have to fix it or make sure they know that we know how horrible that is, or
yeah.
then we're not actually being the sacred witness.
Yes. Yes. 100.
Yeah.
Yes. So to notate, I'm glad that you said that because I do still get emotional. Just
Yeah.
the last one I was on, I like had to kind of do this a little bit because my eyes started welling up. But it's no longer like a full out just breakdown live.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
So yes and yes, I like that. Thank you for the extra little tidbit there.
and just for sharing, I appreciate, you bringing us on this trajectory as far as, how we can investigate triggers.
Yeah,
It's, such an important piece. They're
it
not
is.
bad. They're definitely what happened that instigated the trigger can often be something that, can be bad, most definitely, and we're not in the same place now. So once we can recognize that we're not in that same situation, then we can determine how we address the energy relating to that trigger. And it's not going to go away until it's addressed. I think that's the other important piece to note is that, when I share the bit about Bright Eyes haunting me, he was not going away. And I had done everything that I could to try and make myself not think about him. And his head would pop up in my mind at really intimate moments when it was the last thing I wanted, like breastfeeding my babies or making love with my husband or having a heart to heart with a friend. And all of a sudden it would be like his head would pop up in my mind. And the whole moment of intimacy would be hijacked. And so it was recognizing, okay, like doing all of this, putting all this energy into not thinking about him, putting all this energy into pushing him away, putting all this energy into ignoring that. How's it working for you, Sarah? This was, 10 years after mom died. Was it working? And so we can always do something different, right? And most evidently, if we do something different, we get a different, something different happens. And yeah.
That's fantastic. Why do you do what you do?
Oh, I love it so much. Um, I love supporting people to recognize they have that power within themselves. I think there's nothing that that fills me up we're just holding space for that. I'm thinking about a session I did with somebody a couple of weeks ago that was around the loss of a child. And when we can go inwards and start to form relationship with our grief, because a lot of what I do is a guided journey inwards, so like a led meditation, or and then I have the person I'm supporting tell me what they're noticing, and we go from there. We let their focus guide wherever we are, whatever we're accessing, with the awareness that we're holding it in our body, right? It's not outside of us. And so in her finding the means that she needed, from creating a safe place outside in nature, to setting up her own altar, to care for her baby, to all of these things that were helping her to resolve this grief that was still sitting inside of her, and she took home some action pieces to bring into her own daily practice. And so I love that. It's creating moments where we recognize who we are as holy and sacred, and then carrying that into the world. And our grief and our trauma are holy and sacred, and they need space to be honored as that, rather than shoved into those small recesses in our mind, or those moments where we find ourselves silent, right? And all of a sudden, what we haven't dealt with pops up. We're like, and it's often right before bed or driving in a car, but if we bring our intention to address it, then we're also able to determine what we need to feel safe in doing so. Bring our toolkit with us rather than feeling disarmed in our silent moments. And so that's also a huge part. It's like, hey, if you actually make space to do this, it's not going to render you powerless.
Yeah. I think that's the fear, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, for a long time, I used to think, why would I want to go back into that time period? Whether it was the 10 days that mom was missing, whether it was the following year and a half. The trial was in March, April of 1997. All the newspaper articles, all of it was such a public case. And that was such a part of the grief too. So it was like, even to write my book, and that took probably about 10 years or more. And then I think I scrapped the manuscript that I'd written, and 2 years ago, I sat down and wrote the one that we see. But there's that fear of, if I go back into that time period, then the same thing will happen again. I'll have those same feelings. And some of those feelings and some of those bits will be similar. You're also dealing with them at an older age, with a different level of tools and perhaps support team. And you can go into the parts bit by bit. You never have to land in the whole thing at once. Like, we really do get to determine that.
Yeah. And that's the key.
Yeah. And then I think what, my long-term goals has always been the recognition that when we're addressing our own stuff, we become inspired to bring that into the world, and we can then bring what we discover into our communities and into our environment and into our world, because instead of running from what we're afraid of all the time, we start to recognize our power to make a difference. And so we can address some of the challenges that we're seeing, whether that's the dysfunction in our societies, our global environmental issues. Our world needs us. We really have got to stop being stuck with our heads up our asses, avoiding the things that are challenging. Life is hard. That's life. And it's amazing, and it's beautiful, and it's filled with joy. And every day is probably going to have some of all of that in it. And so we can take, some of our own gifts and bring those into the world. The world needs us. So I think that's the biggest piece in trauma as medicine, is if we make a decision to cultivate medicine from our hardship, then we become the medicine that is necessary in our world.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sabrina.
And thank you for sharing so openly.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I want to acknowledge those that are watching live. Thank you so much for being here. For those watching on the replay, again, make sure that you hashtag replay. For those of you that resonated with Sarah. Be sure to connect with her, her website, sarahsalterkelly.com, and she's on social media, Facebook, Insta, LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
Is that about right? Awesome.
Yeah, just not on LinkedIn. I haven't used it for so long, I don't remember how.
Facebook and Insta.
Yeah, and Instagram.
We love to connect people here on this platform in order to continue to rise. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm really grateful for you using your platform to support people and sharing their stories. And so just the beauty of that, it is so essential for us to be able to find ourselves in connection with each other. So gratitude to you, Sabrina, for what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those of you here at Her Version. This community is expanding every single day and is filled with females who are striving to do better than they did yesterday. For those of you that are new to this podcast and like content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, follow, like, and share. If you have an amazing story to share, make sure you reach out to me here or at hernation.life. I am your host, Sabrina Victoria, and I'm so grateful to be here sharing a platform that allows people to share their truth and inspire others as